The crimson sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Tucson, Arizona. As Margaret Gallagher gripped her worn leather satchel tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs like a blacksmith's hammer. The year was 1878, and Tuxen was no place for a woman alone, especially one desperate to escape. Margaret had come to the Arizona Territory just 6 months prior, accepting a position as a schoolteacher with dreams of independence and adventure. She'd left her comfortable home in Boston after her parents' passing, seeking a fresh start far from the painful memories. At 23, she possessed a fierce determination beneath her proper exterior, though today that resolve was being sorely tested. "Leaving so soon, Miss Gallagher?" The voice sent a chill down her spine despite the blistering heat. Frank Miller, the saloon owner who'd been pursuing her with unwelcome advances for weeks, now stood blocking her path to the stagecoach office. His breath reeked of whiskey despite the early hour, and 3 of his equally unsavory companions flanked him. "That's mighty disappointing. I thought we had an understanding." Margaret straightened her spine, adjusting the brim of her bonnet to shield her eyes from both the sun and his leering gaze. "There was never any understanding, Mr. Miller. Please step aside. The eastbound stage leaves in 20 minutes. Miller exchanged amused glances with his companions. One of them, a burly man with a pockmarked face and tobacco-stained beard, spat into the dirt. "Ain't no ladies leaving Tuxen today without paying the proper respects." "I've settled all my accounts," Margaret replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I owe nothing to anyone in this town." The third man, rail-thin with a jagged scar across his cheek, moved to her left, effectively cutting off her escape route down the side street. "Frank here says different, says you've been leading him on, making promises." "I've done no such thing." Heat flushed her cheeks as fear gave way momentarily to indignation. The fourth man, shorter than the others but with cold eyes that seemed to calculate her worth in dollars and cents, chuckled. "Education's wasted on girls anyway. Town's better off without you filling children's heads with nonsense." Margaret clutched her satchel tighter, its weight reassuring. Inside was everything she owned in the world: her clothing, her mother's cameo brooch, her books, and the small savings she'd managed to accumulate. Not much, but enough to start again somewhere else, somewhere safer. "Step aside," she repeated, hearing the tremor in her voice despite her efforts. Miller took a step closer, reaching for her arm. "I don't think so, darlin'. You see, the lady asked you to move." The new voice cut through the tension like a knife. Deep, steady, with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heeded. Margaret turned her head slightly, not daring to fully take her eyes off Miller and his friends. A tall figure stood several paces away, his features shadowed by the brim of his hat. He wore a dust-covered duster over simple clothing, a gun belt visible at his hip. Though he stood relaxed, there was a coiled tension in his posture that suggested he could move with frightening speed if necessary. Miller's hand dropped from where it had been about to grab Margaret's arm. "This ain't your business, stranger. You're blocking the public walkway, making it mighty difficult for folks to go about their day." The stranger stepped forward, and Margaret caught her first clear glimpse of his face. Strong jaw dusted with a day's worth of stubble, eyes the color of the sky after a storm, and a mouth set in a determined line. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of Boston gentlemen, but there was something compelling about his weathered features. "We're just having a friendly conversation with Miss Gallagher here," Miller said, false conviviality in his tone. "Doesn't look friendly to me." The stranger's gaze shifted to Margaret. "Madam," Margaret swallowed, finding her voice, "these men are preventing me from reaching the stagecoach office." With deliberate movements, the stranger stepped closer until he stood just a few feet from the group. Up close, Margaret could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his gaze assessed each of the four men with quick precision, the subtle shift of his weight as he positioned himself. 4 against 1, the pockmarked man observed with a sneer. Bad odds, Cowboy. For you, the stranger replied evenly. Something in his tone made Miller hesitate. You know who I am. I own half this town. And that gives you the right to harass a lady. The stranger's hand hadn't moved toward his gun, but somehow his stance had shifted in a way that made it clear he could draw in an instant. I don't care if you own all of Arizona territory. When a woman says move, you move. A tense silence stretched between them. Margaret held her breath, acutely aware that violence could erupt at any moment. Then, unexpectedly, Miller laughed a harsh, forced sound. Come on, boys. The schoolmarm ain't worth getting shot over. He gave Margaret a cold look. You'll be back. There's nothing for women like you out there. With reluctant grumbles, the four men stepped aside, creating a path to the stagecoach office. The scarred man muttered something under his breath that made his companions laugh, but they retreated to the saloon entrance across the street. Margaret exhaled shakily, turning to her unexpected defender. Thank you, sir. You heading for that stage? He interrupted, his eyes still watching Miller and his friends. Yes, to Albuquerque and then east. The stranger nodded once, then met her gaze directly. Walk beside me. It wasn't a request, but neither was it a command. Something about the simple statement touched Margaret deeply, an offer of protection without presumption, a momentary alliance between strangers in a harsh land. I don't even know your name, she said, even as she fell into step beside him. Vincent Quaid, he replied, adjusting his stride to match hers as they moved down the boardwalk. Most folks call me Vince. I'm Margaret Gallagher, the schoolteacher, though I suppose former schoolteacher now. His eyes scanned the street ahead. Leaving in a hurry. Margaret hesitated, unsure how much to share with this stranger who'd come to her rescue. It seemed time to move on. Vince glanced at her, and she had the distinct impression he saw more than she intended to reveal. Miller and his kind have a way of making decent folk feel that way. They reached the stagecoach office, and Margaret stepped up to the counter where a harried clerk was shuffling papers. 1 ticket for the eastbound stage, please. I reserved it yesterday. The clerk barely looked up. Name, Margaret Gallagher. The man ran his finger down a list, then frowned. Don't see you here, miss. That's impossible. I spoke with you personally yesterday afternoon. I paid the deposit. Margaret felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. The clerk shrugged. Not on the manifest. Stage is full anyway. It can't be full. You told me. Sorry, miss. Next stage east leaves in 3 days. He looked past her to Vince. You need something, Quaid. Vince stepped forward. Let me see that passenger list. The clerk hesitated, then turned the paper around. Vince studied it, his expression hardening. Her name was here yesterday. I saw Richardson take her deposit myself. Richardson's off today, the clerk said, too quickly. Vince leaned forward slightly. Miller got to you, didn't he? The clerk's eyes darted nervously. Don't know what you're talking about. Return the lady's deposit. Listen, Quaid, I'm just following her deposit. Now. The clerk's face reddened, but he opened a drawer and counted out several coins, sliding them across the counter. Don't come crying to me when Miller hears about this. Margaret collected the money with trembling fingers. What am I to do now? She murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Outside, the stagecoach was already being loaded. From the doorway, she could see Miller and his friends watching from across the street, satisfaction evident in their postures. They had planned this, ensuring she would be stranded in Tuxen. Come on, Vince said quietly. I'll walk you somewhere safe while you figure out your next move. Margaret wanted to protest, to insist she could manage on her own, but the truth was stark. She was alone in a town where powerful men had decided she shouldn't leave. With reluctance born of necessity rather than distrust, she nodded. As they stepped back onto the street, she was acutely aware of Miller's gaze following them. "I can't go back to my boarding house," she said. "Mrs. Wilson is Miller's cousin. She'll have packed my things by now." Vince nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. The mission at the edge of town. Father Ignacio doesn't answer to Miller or anyone else in Tuxen. They walked in silence for several blocks, Margaret's mind racing with possibilities, each seeming more impossible than the last. Return east with no position waiting. Seek employment in another frontier town. The meager savings in her purse wouldn't last long. "Why is Miller so determined to keep you here?" Vince asked finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Margaret hesitated. "I rebuffed his advances multiple times, but it's more than that. His son was in my class, a bright boy, but troubled. When I caught him cheating and reported it to the school board, Miller was furious, said I was trying to humiliate his family. And the school board sided with him, of course. When I protested, they suggested perhaps I wasn't suited to the challenges of educating frontier children." The bitterness in her voice surprised even herself. "I resigned rather than face dismissal. Miller's been persistent since then, claiming I owe him for damaging his reputation." They turned down a quieter street, the adobe buildings offering some shade from the relentless sun. Margaret became aware that Vince was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "You're not what I expected from an Eastern schoolteacher." "And what did you expect, Mr. Quaid?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Someone who'd have fainted dead away at the first sign of trouble, I suppose." Margaret couldn't help but return his smile, though it was tinged with weariness. "I've learned that fainting rarely solves anything." They reached the mission, a simple structure with whitewashed walls that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Before they could approach the entrance, the door opened and an elderly priest emerged, his lined face breaking into a smile when he spotted them. "Vincent, it has been too long, my son." His accent revealed his Spanish heritage, though he spoke English fluently. "Father Ignacio." Vince removed his hat respectfully. "This is Miss Gallagher. She needs sanctuary for a short while." The priest's keen eyes assessed Margaret, noting her distress despite her composed exterior. "Frank Miller?" he asked simply. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" Father Ignacio sighed. "You are not the first young woman to seek refuge here because of that man. Come inside, both of you." The interior of the mission was cool and quiet, a blessed relief from the heat and tension of the streets. Father Ignacio led them to a small room furnished simply with a wooden table and chairs. "You will be safe here, Miss Gallagher," he assured her. "Miller does not dare cross the threshold of God's house, whatever his other sins may be." "I can't impose," Margaret began, but the priest waved away her protest. "There is a small room where our visiting sisters stay when they come from Santa Fe. It is yours for as long as needed." He turned to Vince. "Will you stay for a meal, Vincent? Sister Maria has made her famous stew." Vince hesitated, glancing at Margaret. Something in his expression suggested he was reluctant to leave her, though they had been strangers mere hours ago. "Please," Margaret said, surprising herself with the invitation. "I owe you a proper thank you for your help." A shadow of a smile crossed his face. "Seems I've earned myself a bowl of Sister Maria's stew, then." Father Ignacio beamed. "Excellent, I will inform her we have guests." He patted Margaret's hand reassuringly. "Rest, my child. We will speak more over dinner." After the priest left, an awkward silence fell between them. Margaret removed her bonnet, aware of how disheveled she must look after the morning's events. Vince had taken a seat at the table, his hat resting beside him, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. "You know Father Ignacio well?" she asked, seeking to break the silence. Vince nodded. "He patched me up a few times when I first came to Arizona. Man's got a way of finding folks when they're at their lowest. And were you at your lowest?" His eyes met hers, and something in them made her breath catch. "Lower than I'd care to remember." Before she could respond, the door opened, and a smiling nun entered carrying a pitcher of water and cups. "Father says you've had quite a morning," she said cheerfully. "This will refresh you before dinner." The simple hospitality of the mission wrapped around Margaret like a blanket. For the first time since the confrontation in the street, she felt her shoulders relax slightly. She was safe for the moment at least. As Sister Maria poured water for them, Margaret found herself studying Vince Quaid more carefully. He wasn't what she would have imagined as a protector. There was none of the brash showmanship she'd come to associate with Western men. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that spoke of experiences she could only guess at. "How long have you been in Tuxen, Mr. Quaid?" she asked when they were alone again. "Off and on for a couple of years. I ranch about 20 miles north." "Alone," he nodded. "Just me and about 60 head of cattle, nothing fancy." Margaret tried to imagine it, the solitude, the responsibility, the freedom. So different from the structured world she'd known in Boston, or even the confined role she'd occupied as Tuxen's schoolteacher. "And before Tuxen," she pressed, curious despite herself. A subtle tension entered his posture. "Moved around, Texas, Colorado, California for a spell." "Looking for something?" His eyes met hers, unexpectedly direct. "Or running from something? Isn't that why most of us end up out here?" The question hung between them, too perceptive to dismiss, too personal to answer lightly. Margaret looked down at her hands, noting the faint ink stains on her fingers, permanent marks of her profession. "I came seeking adventure," she admitted. "My parents died within months of each other, influenza. The house was too empty, too full of ghosts. When I saw the advertisement for teachers in the Arizona territory, it seemed providential. And now," she looked up, meeting his gaze steadily, "now I wonder if I was simply running away, as you said, if I was prepared for the realities of this place." "Few of us are," Vince said quietly. "The territory has a way of stripping you down to what's true." Before Margaret could respond to this surprisingly philosophical observation, Father Ignacio returned to inform them dinner was ready. They followed him to a small dining room where a simple but aromatic meal awaited: beef stew, fresh bread, and a plate of sliced cactus pear. Conversation over dinner centered on safer topics: the mission's work with local indigenous peoples, the weather, Sister Maria's legendary recipes. Yet Margaret was acutely aware of Vince's presence across the table, the careful way he chose his words, the respectful attention he gave to Father Ignacio's stories. As the meal concluded, the priest addressed the question that had been weighing on Margaret's mind. "What will you do now, my child?" She set down her spoon with a sigh. "I'm not certain. The stage east won't leave for 3 days, and I suspect Mr. Miller will ensure I'm not on it when it does." "You could file a complaint with the marshal," Vince suggested, though his tone suggested he didn't hold much faith in this solution. "Marshal Davis," Father Ignacio scoffed gently. "The man who looks the other way when Miller's establishments violate every ordinance." "I think not." Margaret's shoulders slumped slightly. "Perhaps I could find work in another town, Bisbee or Tombstone." "Both firmly in Miller's sphere of influence," the priest said. "His gambling operations extend throughout the Southern Territory." A heavy silence fell over the table as the reality of her situation sank in. Margaret had underestimated Frank Miller's reach, and his determination to punish her for the perceived slight against his family. "I need to leave Arizona entirely," she said finally. "New Mexico, perhaps, or Colorado." Vince had been quiet, his expression thoughtful. Now he looked up, meeting Margaret's eyes. "I'm driving cattle to Santa Fe next week, 300 miles. It's no stagecoach rough country, long days in the saddle." He paused. "But Miller's men won't follow a cattle drive." Margaret stared at him, shocked by the offer. "You would take me with you. I could use a hand with the chuck wagon. My usual cook broke his leg last month." "I hardly know how to cook over an open fire," Margaret protested. A hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. "Can you make coffee and beans?" "Yes, but then you're qualified." Trail food ain't about fancy preparation. Father Ignacio was watching them with interest. "It would solve your immediate problem, Margaret, and Santa Fe has several fine schools that might value an experienced teacher." The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Weeks on the trail, far from civilization, with a man she barely knew and likely several cowhands. It was improper, potentially dangerous, and certainly not what her parents would have considered suitable for their daughter. Yet what were her alternatives? Remain in Tuxen under Miller's shadow. Attempt to reach another town where his influence might still follow her. "Your reputation would be at risk," Vince said, seeming to read her thoughts. "I understand if that's too high a price." Margaret almost laughed at that. "My reputation?" "Mr. Quaid, I'm currently hiding in a mission because 4 men tried to prevent me from leaving town. I think concerns about propriety are somewhat beside the point now." The corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Fair enough. How many men would be on this drive?" she asked, practical considerations taking precedence. "Just 3 of us. Me, you, and my ranch hand, Tomas. He's Apache, been working with me for about a year now." Vince leaned forward slightly. "It won't be easy, Miss Gallagher. Long days, cold nights, dust in places you didn't know could collect dust, but we'd get you to Santa Fe safely." Margaret took a deep breath, weighing the dangers against the opportunity for true escape. "When would we leave?" "Day after tomorrow. Need to gather the herd, load the supplies." Father Ignacio cleared his throat. "You would be welcome to stay here until then, Margaret, and perhaps Sister Maria could help prepare you for the journey." The decision crystallized in her mind, clear and certain despite its audacity. "Very well, Mr. Quaid. It seems I'm to be your cook for the journey to Santa Fe." Vince studied her for a moment, and she had the distinct impression he was reassessing his initial judgment of her. Then he nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both approval and respect. "We leave at dawn, day after tomorrow," he said. "Pack light, but warm. Nights get cold in the high country." The practicality of his advice grounded what otherwise felt like an impulsive, even reckless decision. Margaret straightened her shoulders, embracing the path before her with the same determination that had brought her west in the first place. "I'll be ready." The following day passed in a flurry of preparation. Sister Maria proved to be a wealth of practical knowledge, helping Margaret modify her clothing for the rigors of the trail. One of her teaching skirts was split and stitched into makeshift riding pants to wear beneath a shortened skirt scandalous by Boston standards, but practical for weeks in the saddle. "Men's clothing would be easier," Sister Maria commented pragmatically as she worked. "But I understand the compromise." The nun also taught her the basics of camp cooking, how to maintain a fire in wind, how to judge the heat for proper coffee, how to make biscuits in a Dutch oven. Margaret took notes as diligently as her students once had, determined to prove herself useful. Father Ignacio provided a small but sturdy tent, insisting she would need privacy on the trail. "Vincent is an honorable man," he assured her, "but still, a woman must have her own space." In the afternoon, a package arrived from Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, Margaret's trunk, delivered by a young Mexican boy who refused to say who had sent him. Inside, she found her clothing, books, and personal items, including her mother's jewelry box. A wave of relief washed over her. She had feared everything lost. That evening, Vince returned to the mission to discuss final arrangements. He brought with him a sturdy bay mare with gentle eyes. Mariposa, he introduced as Margaret cautiously stroked the horse's velvety nose. She's steady on the trail and doesn't spook easy. She'll serve you well. She's beautiful, Margaret said sincerely, though inwardly she wondered if her limited riding experience would be sufficient. She'd learned the basics at a Boston riding academy, but that hardly prepared one for weeks on the trail. Vince seemed to read her concern. We'll start slow. She'll follow the herd without much guidance. They walked Mariposa to the small stable behind the mission while Vince explained the route. They would take north through the San Pedro Valley, then east across the mountains before turning northeast toward Santa Fe. 3 weeks if the weather holds and the rivers aren't high, he explained. We'll skirt the Apache territories where we can. You mentioned your ranch hand is Apache, Margaret observed. Vince nodded. Tomas. His mother was Mexican, father Apache. Walks in both worlds, belongs to neither. Good man with cattle, better with horses. And he doesn't mind me coming along. A faint smile touched Vince's lips. Tomas doesn't concern himself much with conventional thinking. He goes his own way. As they settled Mariposa in a stall with fresh hay, Margaret gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. Why are you doing this, Mr. Quaid? Taking such a risk for a stranger? Vince was silent for a moment, his hands working efficiently to unsaddle the mare. Finally, he said, I've seen what happens when good people look the other way. Miller and men like him thrive on that silence. He glanced at her. And maybe I've been alone on that ranch too long. Company might be welcome, even if it comes with complications. The simple honesty of his answer touched her. Well, I'm grateful, regardless of your reasons. They walked back toward the mission in comfortable silence, the setting sun painting the adobe walls with golden light. At the door, Margaret hesitated. Dawn tomorrow, then? Vince nodded. I'll be here. Try to get some sleep. Margaret almost laughed at that. Sleep seemed unlikely when her mind was racing with equal parts excitement and trepidation. Good night, Mr. Quaid. Vince, he corrected. Seems right, given we'll be eating dust together for the next few weeks. Vince, she agreed. And I'm Margaret, though my students called me Miss Gallagher, of course. Not a student, he reminded her with a slight smile. Just a cowboy who could use a decent cup of coffee on the trail. With that, he touched the brim of his hat and turned away, his figure soon swallowed by the deepening dusk. Margaret watched him go, a curious feeling settling in her chest, not quite fear, not quite anticipation, but something new and undefined. She slept surprisingly well that night, exhausted by the day's preparations and lulled by the mission's peaceful atmosphere. Her dreams were a jumble of galloping horses, open skies, and a pair of steady blue eyes watching over her. Dawn found her ready, dressed in her modified riding clothes with a shawl against the morning chill. Her hair was braided severely and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat borrowed from Sister Maria. A small bundle of possessions, only what was absolutely necessary, sat at her feet as she said farewell to Father Ignacio and the nuns who had sheltered her. Go with God, my child, the priest blessed her, pressing a small wooden crucifix into her hand. May he watch over you on your journey. Margaret was surprised to feel tears threatening. These people had been strangers 2 days ago, yet their kindness had created a connection that felt significant. Thank you for everything. The sound of hoofbeats announced Vince's arrival. He was not alone. Beside him rode a younger man with copper skin and sharp features, his black hair tied back with a leather thong. Behind them plodded several pack mules laden with supplies, and a sturdy wagon drawn by two dun-colored mules. "Morning, Margaret," Vince greeted her, swinging down from his horse. "This is Tomas." The Apache man nodded to her, his expression giving away little. "Miss." "It's good to meet you, Tomas," Margaret said, hoping her smile conveyed sincere gratitude. "I appreciate you allowing me to join your journey." Something in her words or manner must have passed muster, for Tomas's stern expression softened slightly. "Vince says you cook. Better than him is all I ask." "A low bar," Vince remarked dryly, loading Margaret's bundle onto one of the pack mules. "You ready?" Margaret took a deep breath, looking back at the mission one last time. "Ready." With Vince's help, she mounted Mariposa, adjusting her modified skirt as best she could for modesty while still allowing her to sit astride. The mare shifted beneath her, warm and alive, and Margaret felt a surprising surge of confidence. This was happening. She was leaving Tuxen behind, embarking on an adventure far beyond anything she'd imagined when she first traveled west. Father Ignacio raised his hand in blessing as they set out, the morning sun at their backs as they headed north. They rode in silence until the mission disappeared from view, the town giving way to scrubland dotted with saguaro cacti and mesquite. "We'll meet the herd about 5 miles north," Vince explained. "Tomas has had them grazing in Hidden Valley the past few days. From there, we follow the San Pedro as far as we can." Margaret nodded, already feeling the unfamiliar strain in her muscles from riding. She would be sore tonight, she knew, and likely for many days to come. But the discomfort seemed a small price for freedom. As they rode, she found herself studying Vince's profile against the landscape. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, his movements in harmony with the animal beneath him. There was an openness to his face in the morning light, a clarity that suited the vast landscape surrounding them. They crested a small rise, and suddenly the valley opened before them. In the distance, she could see a dark mass moving slowly across the landscape, the cattle, perhaps 60 or 70 head, grazing their way northward. "Your first cattle drive," Vince observed, noting her wide-eyed expression. "It's impressive," Margaret said truthfully. "I've only seen cattle in much smaller groups." Tomas, who had been mostly silent, spoke up. "Wait until they stampede, then it's impressive." "Tomas," Vince warned, but Margaret laughed. "I appreciate the honesty," she told the Apache. "I'd rather know what I might face than be sheltered from it." Something like approval flickered in Tomas's dark eyes. "Most white women want pretty lies." "I've had enough of those to last a lifetime," Margaret said, thinking of the school board's platitudes when they effectively dismissed her. They reached the herd by mid-morning. Up close, the cattle were larger and more intimidating than Margaret had anticipated, massive creatures with sharp horns and wary eyes. She kept Mariposa at a respectful distance as Vince and Tomas rode around the perimeter, checking the animals and conferring quietly. "We'll move them north along the valley floor," Vince explained when he returned to where Margaret waited with the chuck wagon. "You'll drive the wagon ahead of us, find a good spot to make camp each evening. We'll catch up with the herd." It seemed straightforward enough, though Margaret suspected the reality would be considerably more challenging. Still, she nodded confidently. "I can manage that." Vince handed her a folded piece of paper, a rough map with landmarks noted in a surprisingly neat hand. "Follow this. If you get lost, stay put. We'll find you." The casual confidence of that last statement was oddly reassuring. Margaret tucked the map into her pocket and took the reins of the wagon team, settling onto the wooden seat. It was different from controlling Mariposa. The mules were stronger, more stubborn, requiring a firmer hand. "Hiya," she called, snapping the reins as she'd seen teamsters do. The mules flicked their ears but didn't move. Vince bit back what might have been a smile. "Try again." "They need to know you mean it." Margaret squared her shoulders, drew a deep breath, and channeled the voice she'd used to control 40 rambunctious schoolchildren. "Hiya." The mules lurched forward, nearly throwing her from the seat. She grabbed the wooden edge to steady herself, then straightened, adjusting her grip on the reins. The wagon creaked and groaned as it began to roll forward, following the faint trail that wound northward through the valley. "Good," Vince called after her. "We'll be about 2 hours behind you." And just like that, Margaret Gallagher, formerly a proper Boston schoolteacher, found herself alone in the Arizona wilderness, driving a chuck wagon at the vanguard of a cattle drive bound for Santa Fe. The absurdity of it struck her suddenly, and she laughed aloud, the sound carrying across the empty landscape. Behind her, unseen, Vince watched her go, an unreadable expression on his weathered face. The first day on the trail proved even more challenging than Margaret had anticipated. The wagon bounced and lurched over the uneven ground, every jolt sending pain through her back and shoulders. The sun beat down relentlessly, and dust seemed to find its way into every fold of clothing, every pore of skin. By mid-afternoon, she was parched, exhausted, and beginning to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. The map indicated a small creek ahead where they would make camp, but the landscape all looked distressingly similar to her untrained eye. When she finally spotted the stand of cottonwoods that marked the water source, tears of relief stung her eyes. She guided the mules toward it, bringing the wagon to a halt in a relatively flat area about 50 yards from the creek. Now came the part she dreaded, setting up camp alone before the men arrived with the herd. Sister Maria had given her instructions, but theory and practice were worlds apart. "One step at a time," Margaret murmured to herself, climbing stiffly down from the wagon seat. She unhitched the mules first, watering them at the creek before securing them where they could graze. Next came the fire pit, clearing a space, surrounding it with rocks, gathering wood from the scattered deadfall near the creek. By the time she had a small fire going, sweat streaked her dust-covered face and her hands were scraped and dirty. The Dutch oven presented the next challenge. It was heavier than she'd expected and awkward to position over the fire. She burned her finger in the process, biting back language that would have scandalized her Boston acquaintances. "Beans," she muttered, rummaging through the supplies. "How difficult can beans be?" 2 hours later, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, Margaret heard the distant lowing of cattle. She straightened from where she'd been kneeling by the fire, pushing damp strands of hair from her face. The herd appeared first, a moving mass of horns and hides flowing across the landscape like a living river. Vince and Tomas rode on either flank, occasionally calling out to each other or whistling to redirect a straying animal. It was a scene straight from the dime novels she'd secretly read as a girl, yet the reality was both more mundane and more magnificent. These weren't romantic figures from fiction, but working men performing a difficult task with practiced efficiency. They guided the cattle to a natural depression near the creek where the animals could water and graze for the night. Only when the herd was settled did the two men approach the camp, dismounting with the stiff movements of those who'd spent long hours in the saddle. "You found it," Vince observed, nodding toward her campsite. "The map was clear," Margaret replied, oddly pleased by his apparent approval. "I've started the beans, but I'm afraid they're not quite ready." Tomas dismounted and immediately went to inspect her cooking. He lifted the lid of the Dutch oven, sniffed, then looked at her with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Need salt?" "Oh." Margaret felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I wasn't sure how much to use." The Apache man reached into a saddlebag and produced a small pouch, sprinkling a generous amount into the pot. "And this?" He added something green and dried that Margaret didn't recognize. "What is it?" "Makes beans taste less like beans," was all he would say. Vince, meanwhile, had tended to the horses and was now bringing his bedroll to the fire. "You did well," he told her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "First day's always the hardest." His simple acknowledgement eased something tight in her chest. "I wasn't sure I could do it," she admitted. "But you did." He studied her for a moment. "You're full of surprises, Margaret Gallagher." The way he said her name with a hint of something like admiration sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Margaret turned away, busying herself with preparing the coffee, aware of a strange new tension between them. Dinner was a simple affair: beans, hardtack, and strong black coffee. They ate in relative silence, the fatigue of the day's journey weighing on them all. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and Margaret found herself shivering despite her proximity to the fire. "Your tent's in the wagon," Vince reminded her. "Want help setting it up?" Margaret hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. "If you wouldn't mind showing me how, just this first time." Together, they erected the small canvas structure a short distance from the fire. It was a simple design, but the process involved more stakes and ropes than she'd anticipated. Vince's hands were sure and efficient as he demonstrated each step, his voice patient as he explained the logic behind the placement. "Always position the opening away from the prevailing wind," he instructed. "And make sure these stakes are secure. They're what keeps the whole thing from collapsing on you in the night." When it was complete, Margaret ducked inside to arrange her bedroll. The space was small but private, a luxury she suspected she would come to cherish in the weeks ahead. "Thank you," she said when she emerged, "for your patience. I know this is all very basic to you." Vince shrugged. "Everyone's new to the trail once." He glanced toward where Tomas was already rolled in his blanket, apparently asleep. "We'll start moving at first light. Sleep well, Margaret." "Good night, Vince." Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive that night. Every unfamiliar sound, the soft lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves, the occasional call of a night bird startled her to wakefulness. Her muscles ached from the unaccustomed exertion, and the ground felt impossibly hard beneath her bedroll. Yet, there was something exhilarating about lying there in the darkness, miles from any town, embarking on a journey few women of her acquaintance would ever experience. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, she had made her choice, taken control of her fate in a way that felt significant. With that thought, Margaret finally drifted into a dreamless sleep, lulled by the distant murmur of the creek and the vast silence of the Arizona night. The days fell into a rhythm as they moved northward. Margaret would rise before dawn, rebuild the fire, and prepare coffee and a simple breakfast of biscuits or flapjacks. After the meal, she would break camp and drive ahead with the chuck wagon while Vince and Tomas managed the herd. Each evening brought the same routine in reverse: establishing camp, starting the evening meal, tending to the mules. As the days passed, these tasks became less daunting, her movements more assured. She learned to judge the proper heat for baking biscuits in the Dutch oven, discovered that adding wild onions found near creek beds improved the flavor of beans, and mastered the art of brewing coffee strong enough to satisfy even Tomas's exacting standards. Her body, too, adapted to the rigors of the trail. The The soreness in her muscles faded, replaced by a new strength and resilience. Her hands, once soft and ink-stained, grew calloused from handling ropes and cooking implements. Her skin darkened under the relentless sun despite her hat and shawl. On the fifth night, as they camped in a sheltered draw with juniper trees providing welcome shade, Vince joined her by the fire while she prepared the evening meal. Tomas had ridden ahead to scout the trail, leaving them alone for the first time since their journey began. "You're getting good at this," he observed, watching as she expertly flipped the cornbread in the Dutch oven. Margaret smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I suppose necessity is a powerful teacher, though I suspect Sister Maria would still find fault with my technique." "Trail cooking isn't about technique, it's about making do with what you have." Vince added a stick to the fire, "like you're doing with this whole situation." The perceptiveness of his comment surprised her. "I haven't had much choice. There's always a choice." "You could have stayed in Tuxen, found a way to placate Miller." Margaret looked up sharply. "By what? Becoming his mistress, allowing him to bully me into silence?" "Some would have." Vince's gaze was steady. "The easier path, not easier, just different consequences." Margaret stirred the beans, gathering her thoughts. "My father was a professor of philosophy at Harvard. He always taught me that our choices define us, not our circumstances." "Wise man." "He was." She smiled softly at the memory. "He wanted me to attend Radcliffe, to follow in his academic footsteps. Mother was horrified. She thought higher education would make me unmarriageable. They compromised on teacher training. And now here you are, cooking beans on the Arizona frontier." There was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet observation. Life seldom follows the paths we imagine for ourselves. Margaret glanced at him curiously. "What about you? Did you always plan to be a rancher in Arizona?" A shadow crossed his face. "No, that came later." His reticence suggested a story he wasn't ready to share, and Margaret respected the boundary. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle. "You have family?" she asked eventually. "Back east or?" "None living." His voice was neutral, but something in his posture suggested the wound was still tender. "Parents died when I was young, raised by an uncle in Missouri. He passed 10 years ago." "I'm sorry." Vince shrugged. "Life out here doesn't lend itself to family connections. Most men I know are solitary by nature or circumstance." "And which are you?" Margaret asked before she could reconsider the personal nature of the question. He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Both, I suspect." Their conversation was interrupted by Tomas's return. The Apache rode into camp with his usual quiet efficiency, dismounting and leading his horse to water before approaching the fire. "Trail looks clear," he reported. "Creek ahead runs strong. Good water." Vince nodded. "Any sign of other travelers?" "Small party heading west. Prospectors, I think." "We'll pass them tomorrow." The mention of other people sent a ripple of anxiety through Margaret. She had grown accustomed to their isolation, the simplicity of interactions limited to Vince and Tomas. The prospect of encountering strangers who might question her presence or recognize her from Tuxen was unsettling. Vince seemed to read her concern. "We won't stop," he assured her. "Just pass with a nod and keep moving." The encounter the next day proved uneventful, just as Vince had predicted. The prospectors, 3 grizzled men with laden mules, showed no interest in their party beyond a cursory greeting. If they found the presence of a woman unusual, they gave no indication. As they continued northward, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills, and the vegetation grew more varied and abundant. Juniper and pine appeared among the cacti, and the air carried the scent of sap and wildflowers. On the 10th day, They began the ascent into the mountains that separated Arizona from New Mexico. The trail narrowed, forcing them to move more slowly, with Margaret and the wagon sometimes falling far behind the herd. It was on one such afternoon, as she navigated a particularly steep section of trail, that disaster nearly struck. One of the wagon wheels hit a rock hidden beneath a drift of pine needles, causing the vehicle to lurch violently to one side. Margaret pulled desperately on the reins, trying to steady the mules, but the wagon continued to tip, threatening to topple down the slope. Just as she felt herself losing control, a rider appeared beside her Tomas, moving with the fluid grace that characterized all his actions. Without a word, he leapt from his horse and grabbed the harness of the lead mule, using his strength and weight to counter the wagon's momentum. For a tense moment, Margaret thought they would both be pulled over the edge. Then the wagon settled, its wheels finding purchase on solid ground once more. "Thank you," she gasped, her heart pounding. "I couldn't hold them." Tomas nodded, his expression as impassive as ever. "Trail gets worse ahead. Vince says we make camp early. There's a meadow half a mile up." The meadow proved to be a welcome respite, a small alpine clearing surrounded by pines, with a clear stream bubbling along one edge. Margaret set up camp with practiced efficiency now, and by the time Vince arrived with the herd, she had a stew simmering over the fire. "Tomas told me what happened," he said as he dismounted. "You all right?" "Just shaken," Margaret admitted. Another few inches and the wagon would have gone over. Vince frowned, studying the steep trail they'd ascended. "We'll have to be more careful tomorrow. This passage is always tricky, but with the dry weather it's worse than usual. Loose rocks everywhere." That evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Tomas surprised Margaret by producing a small wooden flute from his saddlebag. Without preamble, he began to play a haunting melody that seemed to echo the wilderness around them, at once mournful and serene. Margaret listened, entranced. The Apache had spoken perhaps 24 words to her in the 10 days they'd traveled together, yet in his music she heard a depth of expression that transcended language. When the song ended, the silence seemed deeper somehow, more profound. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "What is it called?" Tomas considered for a moment. "In my language it means the distance between stars. My father taught me." "Do all Apache men play the flute?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "Only those who wish to court a woman," Vince interjected, a rare hint of teasing in his voice. "Tomas here has broken many hearts with that flute." The Apache shot him a look that managed to be both annoyed and amused. "Vince talks too much." Margaret smiled, charmed by this glimpse of camaraderie between the two men. "Will you play another?" Tomas obliged with a livelier tune, his fingers dancing over the holes in the simple instrument. This melody spoke of joy and movement, of wild horses and summer winds. When it concluded, even Vince was smiling. "One more," the rancher requested. "The one about the traveler." Tomas nodded and began a third song, slower and more deliberate than the others. As he played, Margaret noticed Vince's expression change, growing more introspective, almost melancholy. She wondered what memories the music evoked for him, what journeys he had undertaken before their paths crossed. The flute's final notes lingered in the cool mountain air, then faded into the crackling of the fire. Tomas set the instrument aside and, without further comment, rolled himself in his blanket and appeared to go immediately to sleep. Margaret and Vince remained by the fire, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. She stared into the flames, thinking about the unexpected turns her life had taken, the strange new world she found herself inhabiting. "A penny for your thoughts," Vince said finally. Margaret smiled. "I was just thinking how different this is from what I imagined when I came west. teaching in a proper schoolhouse, boarding with a respectable widow, attending church socials. She gestured to the wilderness around them. Not this. Disappointed. There was genuine curiosity in his question. Strangely, no. Margaret looked up at the vast canopy of stars above them. There's a freedom here I never knew before. Despite the hardships, despite the uncertainty, I feel more alive than I ever did in Boston or even in Tucson. Vince nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he'd already suspected. The territory does that, strips away the pretenses, shows you who you really are. And who am I, Mr. Quaid? The question slipped out before she could reconsider it, more vulnerable than she'd intended. His gaze met hers across the fire, steady and searching. Someone braver than she knows, someone finding her own path. The simple assessment touched her deeply, recognizing as it did the journey she was undertaking not just physically from Tucson to Santa Fe, but the internal transformation that accompanied it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing that." Vince looked away, seemingly embarrassed by the moment of connection. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be the hardest day yet we cross the highest pass." Margaret nodded and rose, gathering her shawl around her against the mountain chill. "Good night, Vince." As she settled into her tent, she found herself replaying their conversation, analyzing the subtle shifts in his expression, the careful way he chose his words. There was a depth to Vincent Quaid that intrigued her, layers of experience and emotion carefully guarded beneath his pragmatic exterior. For the first time since leaving Tuxen, Margaret fell asleep thinking not of the dangers they'd escaped or the uncertainties that lay ahead, but of the quiet strength of the man who had offered her a path forward when all other doors seemed closed. The mountain crossing proved as challenging as Vince had predicted. The trail narrowed to little more than a rocky path clinging to the mountainside, requiring all of Margaret's concentration to guide the wagon safely. At the steepest sections, Tomas would ride ahead to scout while Vince stayed with her, sometimes walking beside the mules to ensure they didn't shy at crucial moments. By mid-afternoon, they reached the summit, a windswept saddle between two higher peaks. Margaret pulled the wagon to a halt, breathless from the tension of the ascent and the thinness of the air at this elevation. Vince appeared beside her, leading his horse. "Look," he said, gesturing eastward. Margaret turned and caught her breath. Spread before them was a panorama of such vastness and beauty that it momentarily banished all fatigue and discomfort. Rolling foothills gave way to distant plains that stretched to the horizon, painted in shades of gold and amber by the afternoon sun. Far to the northeast, she could just make out a silver ribbon that must be the Rio Grande. "New Mexico territory," Vince said. "We'll be there by nightfall." "It's magnificent," Margaret whispered, overcome by the majesty of the landscape. In that moment, she understood why men like Vince chose this life, despite its hardships and isolation. There was a grandeur here that touched something profound in the human spirit. The descent proved easier than the ascent, though it required constant vigilance to prevent the wagon from gathering too much momentum on the steep grade. By sunset, they had reached a broad, grassy valley that Vince informed her marked the territorial boundary. "We'll rest the herd here for a day," he decided as they set up camp. "They've earned it, and so have we." The prospect of a day without travel was welcome news. Margaret had learned to perform her duties efficiently despite the constant movement. But the opportunity to wash clothes, mend tears, and generally recover from the rigors of the trail was a luxury she hadn't anticipated. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in days, lulled by the knowledge that morning would not bring another grueling journey. When she woke, the sun was already well above the horizon, a shocking departure from their usual pre-dawn rising. She emerged from her tent to find Vince sitting alone by a small fire, a cup of coffee in hand. The sight was so unexpected that she paused, momentarily disoriented. "You made coffee," she observed unnecessarily. He glanced up, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Figured you'd earned a morning off." "Not as good as yours, though." Margaret approached and accepted the cup he offered, taking a cautious sip. It was stronger than she typically made it, but not unpleasant. "Where's Tomas?" "Hunting. Said he was tired of beans and bacon." She settled beside him on the fallen log that served as a bench, enjoying the simple pleasure of a leisurely morning. "I thought cowboys subsisted entirely on beans and bacon. At least, that's what the dime novels would have us believe." "Dime novels," Vince snorted. "Written by men who have never been west of the Mississippi." "You don't consider yourself a cowboy, then?" she teased. He considered this, turning his cup in his hands. "Rancher suits me better. Cowboys drift. I've put down roots." "Your ranch," Margaret nodded. "Is it very large, large enough?" 200 acres, good water rights. Small compared to some, but it's mine, paid for free and clear." There was quiet pride in his voice. "Built the cabin myself. It's nothing fancy, but it keeps out the weather." Margaret tried to picture it, this home he'd carved from the wilderness. "It sounds lovely." Vince looked slightly embarrassed, as if he'd revealed more than he intended. "It's a roof and 4 walls, but the view makes up for what it lacks in refinement." They fell into comfortable silence, watching the cattle grazing peacefully in the valley below. The animals had lost some of their wild energy during the journey, settling into a more docile rhythm under Vince and Tomas's guidance. "What will you do in Santa Fe?" Vince asked suddenly. "After we part ways?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She had been so focused on the journey itself that its end seemed abstract, theoretical. "Fine teaching work, I suppose. Father Ignacio mentioned there are good schools there." "And if that doesn't work out," Margaret considered. "I'm not sure. Continue east, perhaps. Denver or Kansas City." The possibilities stretched before her, at once exciting and daunting. "What about you? After you sell the herd, back to the ranch," Vince said simply. "Winter will be coming. Preparations to make." The thought of him returning alone to his isolated cabin stirred an unexpected melancholy in Margaret. Over the past 2 weeks, she had grown accustomed to his steady presence, the quiet competence with which he faced each challenge. The prospect of continuing her journey without him was more unsettling than she cared to admit. Before she could pursue this disquieting line of thought, Tomas returned, 2 rabbits slung over his shoulder. The rest of the day passed pleasantly in small tasks, washing clothes in the clear stream, mending tears in the wagon canvas, preparing a stew from the fresh game that was a welcome change from their usual fare. By evening, Margaret felt refreshed, ready to face the remainder of their journey with renewed energy. According to Vince, they were now more than halfway to Santa Fe, with the most difficult terrain behind them. 8, maybe 9 more days, he estimated as they sat around the fire after dinner. "Depends on the weather and the river crossings." "Has it been a good journey by your standards?" Margaret asked. Vince exchanged a glance with Tomas. "Better than most. No stampedes, no major injuries, no bandits." "Yet," Tomas added with uncharacteristic humor. Margaret's eyes widened. "Are bandits a real concern?" "Not as much as in the old days," Vince assured her. "But a cattle drive is always a tempting target. We'll keep a closer watch as we get nearer to settlements." The reminder of potential danger sobered the mood around the fire. Margaret had almost forgotten, in the routine of their days, that they were traveling through largely lawless territory, where violence could erupt with little warning. That night, as she lay in her tent listening to the night sounds of the wilderness, Margaret found herself reflecting on how much her perceptions had shifted since leaving Tuxen. Dangers that would have terrified her 3 weeks ago now seemed manageable challenges to be faced with practical preparation rather than fear. Discomforts that would have seemed intolerable were now merely conditions to be endured. And Vince, a man who had been a complete stranger, had become someone whose judgment she trusted implicitly, whose rare smiles she found herself working to earn, whose quiet strength had become a foundation for her own growing confidence. The realization that she was developing feelings for him beyond gratitude or friendship was both startling and somehow inevitable. Margaret turned onto her side, pulling the blanket closer against the night chill, and tried to dismiss the thought as foolishness born of their unusual circumstances. Yet as sleep claimed her, her last conscious thought was of Vince's eyes reflecting the firelight as he'd spoken of his ranch, the home he'd built with his own hands in this wild, beautiful land. The next several days passed without significant incident as they made steady progress across the New Mexico territory. The landscape changed gradually, the pine forests giving way to more open country with scattered juniper and pinyon trees. The weather remained favorable, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that made traveling almost pleasant. Margaret found herself watching Vince more often than was strictly necessary, noting the easy way he sat his horse, the quiet authority with which he gave directions, the rare moments when his serious expression would soften into something approaching contentment as he surveyed the land around them. She caught him watching her too, sometimes quick glances when he thought her attention was elsewhere, a thoughtful assessment that made her wonder what he saw when he looked at her now. The schoolteacher from Boston was long gone, replaced by a woman who could harness mules, cook over an open fire, and navigate by landmarks across open country. On their 5th day in New Mexico, they encountered their first significant obstacle, a river swollen by recent rains in the mountains. What Vince had expected to be a straightforward crossing had become a churning barrier of muddy water. "We'll need to find another place to cross," he decided after studying the river for some time. "Tomas, ride upstream, see if there's a narrower point. I'll check downstream." "What should I do?" Margaret asked, unwilling to simply wait while the men searched. Vince considered her for a moment, then nodded toward a small rise overlooking the river. "High ground. Keep an eye on the herd. If they start to drift toward the river, use this." He handed her a small brass whistle. 3 sharp blasts. "Tomas, or I will come back." The responsibility was unexpected but welcome. Margaret took the whistle and made her way to the vantage point, from which she could see both the grazing cattle and a considerable stretch of the river in both directions. The men were gone for over an hour. Margaret kept vigilant watch, occasionally using field glasses Vince had lent her to scan the riverbanks. She spotted Tomas first, returning at an easy trot from upstream. A few minutes later, Vince appeared from the opposite direction. They conferred briefly, then Vince rode toward her position while Tomas began gathering the herd. "Any luck?" Margaret asked as Vince dismounted beside her. Tomas found a place about 3 miles upstream. An island in the middle creates a natural ford. He squinted against the afternoon sun. "It'll still be a difficult crossing but manageable." "And the wagon, that's the problem," Vince frowned. "The ford's too rough for wheels. We'll need to unload everything, take it across on horseback, then float the empty wagon." The process he described sounded arduous and potentially dangerous. "Is there no other way?" "We could wait for the river to drop," Vince acknowledged. "But that could take days we don't have. The buyer in Santa Fe is expecting the herd on schedule." Margaret nodded, understanding the economic reality that drove their decision. "I'll help however I can." "I know you will." There was a warmth in his voice that sent a flutter through her chest. "You've proven that a dozen times over." They made camp that night near the river, the sound of rushing water a constant backdrop to their preparations. Vince and Tomas spent the evening planning the crossing in detail, considering contingencies and potential problems. "The mules will be reluctant," Vince explained to Margaret. "They don't like moving water. We'll need to lead them individually, which means multiple crossings." "I can lead one," Margaret offered. Both men looked at her in surprise. Tomas spoke first. "River is strong if mule panics." "I understand the risk," she said firmly. "But it makes more sense than having you both make extra trips." Vince studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You'll take Mariposa across first, get familiar with the ford, then come back with me for the first mule. Tomas will handle the cattle." The plan settled. They retired early, aware that the next day would test them all. Dawn brought a sky heavy with clouds, though no immediate threat of rain. They broke camp efficiently, packing everything into bundles that could be secured to the horses for the crossing. The empty wagon, stripped of even its seat, looked forlorn and vulnerable. "Ready?" Vince asked as Margaret mounted Mariposa. She nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The river's roar seemed louder this morning, more threatening. They rode upstream to the ford Tomas had located. Seen up close, the crossing looked even more intimidating, a stretch of river perhaps 40 yards wide, with an island of gravel and stone creating a natural break in the current about halfway across. The water moved swiftly, churning around rocks and fallen logs. "Follow me exactly," Vince instructed. "The safe path is narrow. If Mariposa starts to drift, don't fight her too much. She knows water, but keep her pointed toward the island." Margaret swallowed hard and nodded again. Vince urged his horse forward and she followed, feeling Mariposa tense beneath her as they approached the water's edge. The mare hesitated, snorting nervously, then stepped into the river at Margaret's gentle insistence. The shock of cold water against her legs made Mariposa sidestep, nearly unseating Margaret. She clutched the saddle horn with one hand, maintaining a steady pressure on the reins with the other. "Easy," she murmured to the horse. "Follow Vince. That's it." The water rose quickly as they moved deeper, soon reaching Margaret's knees, then her thighs. The current pushed against Mariposa's flanks, causing the mare to angle slightly downstream despite Margaret's guidance. "Keep coming," Vince called, his own mount struggling against the force of the water. "Straight line to the island." Margaret focused on his back, ignoring the rush of water around her, the way her skirts billowed and dragged in the current. Mariposa took another step, then another, each one requiring more effort as the river's force intensified. They were perhaps 10 yards from the island when disaster struck. A branch, hidden beneath the surface, struck Mariposa's leg. The mare reared in panic, throwing Margaret sideways. She clung desperately to the saddle, but the combination of wet leather and the awkward angle of her side saddle position worked against her. With a cry, Margaret slid from Mariposa's back and plunged into the frigid water. The current caught her immediately, spinning her away from the horse, from Vince, from the safety of the island. Water filled her nose and mouth as she fought to surface, her clothing dragging her downward. Then strong hands were gripping her arms, pulling her upward. Her head broke the surface and she gasped for air, coughing and sputtering. Vince had somehow dismounted and reached her, his powerful arms now encircling her waist as he fought against the current. "Hold on to me," he shouted over the roar of the river. "Don't let go." Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him as he half swam, half walked them toward the island. His strength seemed impossible as he battled the relentless force of the water, maintaining their position against the current that sought to sweep them downstream. With a final surge of effort, he propelled them onto the gravel shore of the island. They collapsed together, Margaret coughing up river water, Vince breathing heavily from the exertion. "Are you hurt?" he asked as soon as she could breathe normally again. Margaret took inventory of her body, finding scrapes and bruises but nothing serious. "No, just cold." Her teeth were already beginning to chatter as the wind cut through her soaked clothing. Vince pulled her against him, sharing his body heat. "We need to get you dry." "Can you make it the rest of the way across?" She nodded, though the prospect of returning to the water filled her with dread. "What about Mariposa?" She made it across. "Tomas has her." Vince pointed to the far shore, where the Apache was indeed holding the reins of both horses. With Vince's support, Margaret managed to wade through the shallower water on the far side of the island. By the time they reached the opposite bank, she was shaking uncontrollably, her lips blue with cold. "We need to get these wet clothes off you," Vince said matter-of-factly. "Tomas, start a fire. Use some of the dry kindling from the packs." Margaret would have protested the impropriety under normal circumstances, but cold and exhaustion overwhelmed conventional concerns. While Tomas built a fire with remarkable speed, Vince retrieved a blanket from his saddlebag and led Margaret behind a stand of junipers that offered minimal privacy. "Turn around," she managed through chattering teeth. When he complied, she struggled out of her sodden dress and undergarments, wrapping the blanket tightly around herself. "All right." Vince turned back, his expression carefully neutral despite the intimacy of the situation. "Get to the fire. I'll hang these to dry." The warmth of the flames was blissful against her chilled skin. Margaret huddled as close as she dared, gradually feeling sensation return to her numbed extremities. Vince joined her after hanging her clothing on nearby branches, his own garments still dripping. "You should change too," she pointed out. "You're as wet as I was." He shook his head. "I'm going back for the mules. No point changing yet." Margaret looked at him in alarm. "You're going back across after what just happened. The herd needs to cross before dark." His tone was gentle but firm. "Tomas will stay with you." "I nearly drowned," Margaret protested, "and I'm supposed to sit here helplessly while you risk the same." "You didn't nearly drown," Vince countered. "You fell in. I got you out. Now we adjust the plan and continue." His pragmatism was both frustrating and oddly reassuring. This was no melodrama where a dunking in the river constituted a catastrophe, merely a setback to be overcome through practical measures. "At least take a few minutes to warm up," she insisted. Vince relented enough to accept a cup of coffee that Tomas had somehow managed to prepare. As he drank, some of the tension left his shoulders. "You handled yourself well out there." Margaret gave a short laugh. "I fell off my horse. Before that, you kept your head, didn't panic." He met her eyes over the rim of the cup. Not everyone would. The simple praise warmed her almost as much as the fire. "Thank you for saving me." Vince seemed almost embarrassed. Anyone would have done the same. "But it wasn't anyone. It was you." Margaret held his gaze, trying to convey the depth of her gratitude. "You've been saving me since Tuxen, Vince. In ways I don't think you realize." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a momentary vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. For a heartbeat, Margaret thought he might say something significant, something that would acknowledge the connection that had been growing between them. Instead, he stood, handing the empty cup to Tomas. "I'll be back with the first mule before your clothes are dry. Stay warm." As he rode away, leading his horse back toward the crossing, Margaret felt a curious mixture of frustration and admiration. His dedication to duty was absolute, his focus unwavering. Yet she couldn't help wondering what might have happened if he'd allowed himself just a moment longer by the fire, a moment to explore the unspoken current that ran between them, alongside the river's more visible flow. The crossing consumed the remainder of the day. True to his word, Vince returned with the first mule before Margaret's clothing had fully dried. She dressed anyway, unwilling to remain passive while the men worked. Despite Tomas's skeptical look, she insisted on helping to unload the bundles from each mule as it arrived, organizing their supplies on the eastern bank. By late afternoon, all their equipment and provisions had been transported across the river. Only the wagon remained on the western side. As Margaret had anticipated, floating the vehicle proved the most challenging task of all. They secured ropes to either end, with Vince and Tomas positioned on opposite shores to guide it through the current. "Stay clear," Vince warned her as they prepared for the attempt. "If those ropes snap, the wagon will become a battering ram." Margaret retreated to a safe distance, watching anxiously as the men coordinated their efforts. The wagon entered the water reluctantly, then caught the current and surged forward with alarming speed. Both men strained against the ropes, fighting to control its trajectory. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked as though the vehicle would capsize in the deepest part of the channel. Then it righted itself and continued its wild journey toward the island. From there, the crossing was easier, the water shallower and less turbulent. As the wagon finally ground to a halt on the eastern shore, Margaret released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The crossing was complete. Despite the setbacks and dangers, they had succeeded. It took another hour to reload the wagon and gather the scattered cattle, which Tomas had herded across a mile downstream where the river widened and slowed. By the time they made camp that evening, everyone was exhausted but satisfied with the day's accomplishment. "We lost some ground," Vince acknowledged as they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, too tired to prepare anything more substantial. "But we're across. That's what matters." "How many more rivers between here and Santa Fe?" Margaret asked, dreading the answer. "None as big as this one," Vince assured her. "A few creeks, but nothing that should give us trouble unless it rains heavily." The mention of rain drew their collective gaze to the sky, where clouds had been gathering throughout the afternoon. The air had the heavy feeling that often preceded a storm. "We should secure everything," Tomas advised, already rising to check the wagon's canvas cover. They worked quickly in the fading light, ensuring that all their supplies were protected from potential rainfall. Margaret reinforced her tent stakes, remembering Vince's early lesson about prevailing winds. The first drops began to fall as they completed their preparations. Within minutes, a steady downpour enveloped the camp, drumming on the wagon canvas and hissing in the campfire until it was extinguished. "Get some rest," Vince called to her over the sound of the rain. "We'll wait it out." Margaret ducked into her tent, grateful for its sturdy construction as water cascaded off the canvas. She arranged her still damp clothing as best she could, then wrapped herself in her blanket and listened to the storm. Despite the hardships of the day, perhaps because of them, she felt a curious sense of accomplishment. She had faced the river, experienced its power firsthand, and emerged stronger for it. The woman who had left Tuxen would have been devastated by such an experience. The woman she was becoming took it as valuable knowledge, another lesson in survival. And Vince, the way he had reached her in the water without hesitation, his arms strong and sure as they fought the current together. The memory of those moments, frightening as they were, held another element that Margaret was only now allowing herself to acknowledge. In his embrace, however brief and born of necessity, she had felt something she'd never experienced before: a recognition, a rightness, as if some part of her had been waiting for precisely that connection. It was foolish, she knew, romantic nonsense born of gratitude and proximity. Yet the feeling persisted, a warm certainty beneath the rational dismissals of her mind. As rain pattered on the canvas above her, Margaret Gallagher drifted into sleep with the memory of strong arms around her waist and the surprising thought that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found something in the wilderness she hadn't even known she was seeking. The storm continued through the night and into the following morning, forcing them to remain in camp longer than planned. By midday, the rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, and Vince made the decision to resume their journey despite the muddy conditions. "We've lost enough time," he explained as they broke camp. "The buyer in Santa Fe won't wait forever." The next 3 days tested their endurance in new ways. The trail, already challenging in places, became treacherous with mud that sucked at the wagon wheels and made footing uncertain for both humans and animals. Progress was painfully slow, with frequent stops to free the wagon from particularly deep sections of mire. Yet the delay had one unexpected benefit: it gave Margaret and Vince more opportunities to talk. With Tomas often riding ahead to find the most navigable path, they found themselves alone together for long stretches. Their conversations, once limited to practical matters of the journey, gradually deepened to include more personal reflections. "Did you always want to be a teacher?" Vince asked as they walked beside the wagon, giving the mules a rest on a particularly steep incline. Margaret considered the question. "I think I wanted to be useful, more than anything. Teaching seemed a natural fit. I've always loved books, ideas." She glanced at him. "Though I'm discovering there are many ways to be useful that don't involve grammar lessons." That earned her a rare smile. "You'd have made a fine rancher's wife in another life. Got the grit for it." The casual observation sent a flutter through Margaret's chest. A dubious compliment, but I'll accept it nonetheless. "Not dubious at all." Vince's voice was serious now. "Takes a special kind of strength to adapt the way you have. Most women, most men, for that matter, would have crumbled facing half what you've endured." Margaret felt her cheeks warm at the genuine admiration in his tone. "I've had excellent guidance." Their eyes met briefly before Vince looked away, focusing on the trail ahead. "Trail teaches most of it. I just filled in the gaps." It was typical of him, deflecting praise, minimizing his own role. Over the past weeks, Margaret had come to recognize this as a fundamental aspect of his character. Vince Quaid was a man who did what needed doing without fanfare or expectation of recognition. As they continued northward, the landscape began to shift again. The terrain became more varied, with rolling hills giving way to flat stretches and occasional dramatic rock formations thrusting up from the earth. Wildlife was more abundant here: deer grazing in meadows, hawks circling overhead, once even a black bear watching their passage from a distant ridge. "God's country," Vince remarked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Worth every hardship just to witness this." Margaret, seated beside him on a fallen log that served as their bench, nodded in agreement. "I understand now why people come west despite the dangers. There's a purity to it, a sense of possibility." "And challenge," Vince added, "forces you to become more than you were." "Or reveals what was already there," Margaret suggested softly. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Maybe so." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken thoughts. Then Tomas approached with freshly filled coffee cups, and the spell was broken. That night, Margaret lay awake long after the camp had fallen silent, replaying the conversation in her mind. There had been something in Vince's voice, in the way he'd looked at her, that suggested his thoughts might be running parallel to her own. Yet he maintained a careful distance, never quite crossing the invisible line between companionship and something more intimate. Was it propriety that held him back? Concern for her reputation? Or perhaps he simply didn't share the growing attraction that she found increasingly difficult to deny. The questions followed her into restless dreams where she and Vince stood on opposite banks of a rushing river, unable to cross the divide between them. On the 16th day of their journey, they crested a rise to see a cluster of buildings in the distance, the first settlement they'd encountered since leaving Arizona. According to Vince, it was a small trading post called Valencia, where they could replenish their dwindling supplies. "We'll stop for a few hours," he decided. "Get what we need and move on. I'd prefer to make camp away from town." Margaret understood his caution. After weeks in the wilderness, the prospect of interacting with strangers was both appealing and somewhat daunting. She was acutely aware of her appearance, her once neat teaching clothes now patched and trail-worn, her hands calloused from work, her skin tanned by the sun. As they approached the settlement, she found herself unconsciously straightening her posture, adjusting her hat to a more becoming angle. Vince noticed and raised an eyebrow. "Worried about making a good impression on the local gentry," he teased. Margaret flushed slightly. "Old habits. My mother would be horrified to see me now. You look—" Vince hesitated, seemingly searching for the right word. "Real. Not like those painted dolls in town saloons or the pinched matrons at church socials. Just real." It was perhaps the most personal comment he had made about her appearance, and Margaret found herself unexpectedly moved by the simple assessment. "Thank you, I think." Valencia proved to be little more than a collection of adobe buildings clustered around a central plaza. A general store, a smithy, a small cantina, and a handful of residences comprised the entirety of the settlement. Yet after weeks of isolation, it seemed bustling with activity. They drew curious glances as they rode into town. A cattle drive was evidently not a common sight here, and a woman traveling with such an outfit even less so. Margaret was conscious of the speculation in the gazes that followed them, the quiet conversations that paused at their approach. Vince handled the interactions with quiet efficiency, arranging for the purchase of flour, coffee, sugar, and other necessities, while Tomas secured fresh vegetables from a local garden. Margaret found herself at loose ends, uncomfortably aware of her anomalous position, neither a proper lady nor fully a member of the cattle drive's working crew. She was standing outside the general store, watching a group of children play in the dusty plaza, when a woman approached her. Middle-aged, with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years in the harsh New Mexico climate, she smiled tentatively. "Forgive my boldness," the woman said in lightly accented English, "but are you traveling with those men?" "The ones with the cattle," Margaret nodded, instantly on guard. "Yes, we're bound for Santa Fe, alone with no chaperone." There was concern rather than judgment in the question. "Circumstances necessitated it," Margaret replied, her tone polite but reserved. The woman studied her for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "I am Elena Vasquez. My husband runs the cantina. Would you care for some tea? Real tea, not the trail coffee your companions surely make." The unexpected kindness caught Margaret off guard. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted. "That would be lovely, thank you." She followed Elena to a small adobe home behind the cantina. The interior was simple but immaculately kept, with colorful woven blankets adorning the walls and the scent of herbs hanging in the air. It was the first proper house Margaret had been in since leaving Tuxen, and the domesticity of it struck her with surprising force. "Sit, please." Elena gestured to a wooden chair at a small table. "The water is already hot." As the woman busied herself preparing the tea, Margaret glanced around the modest home, noting the touches that made it a true dwelling rather than merely shelter: the carefully arranged shelves of pottery, the neatly swept floor, the lace curtains at the single window. "You have a lovely home," she offered sincerely. Alina smiled as she set a steaming cup before Margaret. "It is humble, but it is ours. 23 years we have lived here, my Raphael and I, raised 3 children who are now grown with families of their own." Margaret sipped the tea gratefully, realizing how much she had missed this simple, civilized ritual. "The children I saw in the plaza, your grandchildren?" "Some, yes." Alina settled across from her with her own cup. "Now, perhaps you will tell me why a young woman like yourself travels with cattlemen. It is not common, even in these modern times." There was no judgment in her tone, only genuine curiosity, and Margaret found herself explaining the circumstances that had led her to join Vince's cattle drive. Alina listened without interruption, her expression shifting from concern to understanding as the story unfolded. "So this Mr. Quaid," she said when Margaret had finished, "he offered his protection without expectations?" Margaret nodded. "He's been a perfect gentleman. Both men have." Alina studied her thoughtfully. "And yet there is something more, I think, in your voice when you speak of him." The perceptiveness of the observation brought heat to Margaret's cheeks. "We've faced many challenges together. It creates a bond." "Ah," the older woman smiled knowingly. "A bond." "Yes, that is what my Raphael and I had when we first met. He was a trader, I was the daughter of a rancher. My father did not approve, but the bond, as you say, it was stronger." Margaret looked down at her tea, unwilling to acknowledge the accuracy of Alina's gentle probing. "Mr. Quaid and I come from different worlds. When we reach Santa Fe, those worlds will separate again, perhaps." Alina reached across the table to pat her hand. "Or perhaps the journey has changed you both, created a new world where you might find a place together." The possibility, articulated so simply by this stranger, resonated with thoughts Margaret had barely allowed herself to consider. Before she could respond, a knock at the door announced Vince's arrival. "Pardon the interruption," he said, hat in hand. "We're ready to move on, Margaret." Alina rose to greet him. "You must be Mr. Quaid. I am Alina Vasquez. I've been enjoying your companion's company." Vince nodded politely. "Madam, hope she hasn't been troubling you." "Not at all. In fact, I was just telling her what a fortunate man you are to have such a capable woman on your journey." Alina's direct gaze seemed to see right through him. Such women are rare treasures. Vince shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "She's been a great help, that's certain." Margaret gathered her shawl, thanking Alina for the tea and hospitality. As they stepped outside, she was aware of a new tension between herself and Vince, as if Alina's perceptive comments had somehow made tangible the unspoken currents that had been developing between them. They rejoined Tomas and the herd at the edge of town, continuing northward as the afternoon sun began its westward descent. For several miles they traveled in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Finally, Vince drew his horse alongside the wagon. "Everything all right?" "With that woman in town, Alina?" "Yes, she was very kind, just offered tea and conversation." "What did she want?" Margaret smiled slightly at his suspicious tone. "Not everyone has ulterior motives, Vince. She was curious about my circumstances, that's all." "It's not every day a woman passes through town with a cattle drive." He relaxed somewhat. "Folks out here can be nosy, not used to minding their own business like city people." I found it refreshing, actually, her directness. Margaret hesitated, then added, "She thought we made a good team." Vince glanced at her sharply. "Did she now? MMM." Margaret kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "She and her husband have been married 23 years, built a life here from nothing." Takes a special kind of woman to thrive in these parts, Vince observed, his tone carefully neutral. And a special kind of man to recognize her value. The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge directly. After a moment, Vince nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. 5 more days to Santa Fe if the weather holds, he said. Then you'll be free to pursue whatever future you choose. There was something in the way he said it, a hint of regret, perhaps, that gave Margaret pause. As will you, she pointed out. Vince met her gaze directly. Some choices become clearer on the trail. Things a man might not have considered before. It wasn't quite a declaration, but it was more than he had offered previously. Margaret felt her heart quicken. Such as... But Vince merely touched the brim of his hat and urged his horse forward to check on the lead cattle, leaving Margaret to wonder exactly what possibilities he might be considering as their journey neared its conclusion. That evening, as they made camp by a small stream surrounded by cottonwoods, the dynamic between them had shifted subtly. Margaret was acutely aware of Vince's gaze following her as she performed her usual tasks, and he seemed to find more reasons than usual to be near the chuck wagon as she prepared dinner. Tomas noticed the change, a knowing smile touching his normally impassive features as he observed their interactions. When Vince went to check on the herd one final time before darkness fell completely, the Apache approached Margaret by the fire. "He is a good man," Tomas said without preamble. "Stubborn but good." Margaret looked up in surprise. "I know that. He was different before. Harder." Tomas gestured vaguely eastward. "The war changed many men, some never find their way back." It was the first reference anyone had made to Vince's past before Arizona. Margaret hesitated, not wanting to pry yet desperately curious. "He fought in the war." Tomas nodded. "Union cavalry, does not speak of it, but the nightmares come sometimes." The revelation cast Vince's reserved nature in a new light. Margaret had known many veterans in Boston, men who had returned from the conflict physically whole but carrying invisible wounds that never truly healed. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. Tomas shrugged. "He watches you, different than before, like a man seeing water after long thirst." The poetic observation, so unexpected from the taciturn Apache, brought heat to Margaret's cheeks. Before she could respond, Vince returned to camp, and Tomas moved away as silently as he had appeared. The evening passed companionably, with Tomas playing his flute while Margaret and Vince sat side by side listening, occasionally exchanging comments about the music or the progress of their journey. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable familiarity that felt both new and somehow inevitable. As the fire burned low and Tomas retired to his bedroll, Vince remained beside Margaret, staring into the embers with a thoughtful expression. "Penny for your thoughts," she said softly, echoing his words from nights earlier. He glanced at her, the firelight casting shadows across his features. "Just thinking about Santa Fe, the ranch. What comes after?" "And what does come after?" Margaret asked, her heart beating a little faster. Vince was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I came west to escape memories, to find a place where the war couldn't follow me." He looked up at the star-filled sky. "Built the ranch, filled my days with work, told myself it was enough." Margaret remained quiet, sensing he needed to find his own way through these thoughts. "Then Miller and his men blocked your path that day in Tuxen," he continued. "And somehow, without planning it, I found myself on a different trail altogether." He turned to face her then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I'm not good with words, Margaret, never have been, but these weeks with you, they've reminded me there's more to life than just surviving it. The simple declaration moved her deeply. "I feel the same," she admitted. "When I left Boston, I was running away from grief. When I left Tuxen, I was running from danger. But now—" She hesitated, gathering her courage. "Now I find myself wondering if perhaps I've been running towards something all along, something I couldn't have imagined." Vince reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin. "I have nothing to offer but a small ranch and a life that's harder than any you've known. It's not what a woman like you deserves." "Perhaps you should let me decide what I deserve," Margaret suggested, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "These past weeks have taught me more about myself than years in Boston ever did. I'm stronger than I knew, more capable." "You certainly are that," Vince agreed, a hint of pride in his tone. Margaret looked down at their joined hands. "I don't know what awaits me in Santa Fe, but I do know that the thought of saying goodbye to you brings me more sorrow than I expected." It was as close to a confession as she dared make. The ball was in his court now to acknowledge what was growing between them or to step back before it could fully bloom. For a long moment, Vince was silent, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Then he looked up, meeting her gaze with newfound resolve. "I'm not asking you to decide anything now," he said carefully, "but when we reach Santa Fe, when you've had time to consider your options, I'd like you to think about coming back to the ranch, not as my cook." A faint smile touched his lips. "Though your biscuits have improved considerably." Margaret couldn't help but laugh at that, even as her heart soared at the implication of his words. "In what capacity would I be returning, Mr. Quaid?" The directness of her question seemed to take him by surprise. Then his smile widened, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his weathered features. "As my wife, Miss Gallagher. If you'd consider such a proposal from a man with more cattle than conversation." Despite the lightness of his tone, there was no mistaking the sincerity in his eyes. Margaret felt a surge of joy so intense it momentarily robbed her of speech. "I would need time," she said when she could trust her voice again, "to be certain it's not just gratitude or the unusual circumstances that have brought us together." Vince nodded, understanding in his expression. "Take all the time you need. The ranch will still be there. So will I." The promise was all the more powerful for its simplicity. This was not a passionate declaration of undying love, but something more enduring, a steady commitment, a door open to a future they might build together. "Then I will think about it," Margaret said softly, very seriously. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it, rising to his feet. "We should get some rest. Long day tomorrow." As he turned to go, Margaret called after him quietly. "Vince," he paused, looking back at her, "thank you for clearing the path that day in Tuxen, for asking me to walk beside you." A smile touched his lips again, not the rare, transformative one of moments before, but something quieter, more intimate. "Best decision I ever made." As Margaret prepared for sleep that night, she found herself filled with a quiet joy that was entirely new to her experience. The future still held uncertainties. There were practical matters to consider, adjustments to be made if she were to accept Vince's proposal. Yet underneath these considerations lay a bedrock of certainty that had been building gradually throughout their journey. In Vince Quaid, she had found not just a protector or companion, but a man whose strength complemented her own, whose values aligned with what she had come to recognize as truly important in life. Whether she had been running from danger or toward destiny when she left Tuxen, Margaret now knew with absolute clarity that her path had led her exactly where she needed to be. The remaining days of their journey passed with a new sweetness, a sense of anticipation that colored even the most mundane tasks. Though nothing in their routine changed, they still rose before dawn, traveled until dusk, performed the same necessary duties. There was an undercurrent of connection that made every shared glance, every brief touch, significant. Vince was careful not to press her for an answer to his proposal, true to his promise to give her time. Yet Margaret caught him watching her sometimes with an expression of quiet hope that warmed her heart. For his part, he seemed more relaxed, more willing to share stories from his past or observations about the land they traversed. Tomas, observant as always, said nothing directly about the change between them, but his approval was evident in small gestures, leaving them alone by the fire in the evenings, taking on tasks that might have been Margaret's to give her more rest, once even presenting her with a small wooden carving of a horse that resembled Mariposa. On the afternoon of the 20th day, they crested a final rise to see Santa Fe spread before them in the valley, below a sprawl of adobe buildings surrounding a central plaza, with the spires of the cathedral rising prominently against the backdrop of distant mountains. "We made it," Margaret breathed, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. Relief at reaching their destination safely, pride in the journey accomplished, and a curious reluctance, knowing that their arrival marked the end of this chapter together. Vince rode up beside the wagon, his expression mirroring her own complicated feelings. "The buyer's ranch is on the outskirts," he explained. "We'll deliver the herd first, then take you into town. There's a decent hotel near the plaza where you can stay while you consider your options." The practical arrangements couldn't disguise the real question that hung between them. Margaret nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness even as she recognized the significance of the coming separation. "How long will you remain in Santa Fe?" she asked. "A few days." "Need to collect payment, purchase supplies for the return journey." He met her gaze directly. "Time enough for you to explore the town, perhaps inquire about teaching positions if that's still your intention." Margaret appreciated that he wasn't assuming her answer, that he was genuinely giving her the freedom to choose her own path. "Yes, I should do that," she agreed, though in her heart, she was already leaning strongly toward a different future. They reached the buyer's ranch by late afternoon, a substantial property with numerous outbuildings and corrals ready to receive the cattle. The owner, a robust man named Harrington with a booming voice and firm handshake, greeted Vince like an old acquaintance. "Quaid, right on schedule as always. And with prime stock from the looks of it." The business of transferring the herd, counting and inspecting the animals, and negotiating final payment consumed the remainder of the day. Margaret remained with the chuck wagon, feeling somewhat superfluous now that their journey was complete. She used the time to organize her few possessions and reflect on the decision that awaited her. The practical considerations were significant. Life on Vince's ranch would be far removed from anything she had known in Boston or even Tuxen. Hard physical labor, isolation from society, the challenges of frontier living, these were realities she couldn't ignore. Yet the past weeks had proven she was capable of adapting to such conditions, even finding fulfillment in them. More importantly, she had discovered a strength within herself that city life had never called upon, a capacity for resilience that gave her confidence to face whatever challenges might arise. And then, there was Vince himself. Not the romantic hero of fiction, but a real man with his own history of pain and loss, his own quiet determination to build something worthwhile from the raw materials of this untamed land. A man whose integrity she trusted implicitly, whose company she had come to treasure, whose rare smiles she wanted to spend a lifetime earning. By the time Vince approached the wagon at dusk, his business with Harrington concluded, Margaret had reached a decision. However, She would follow her own plan, take the time in Santa Fe he had offered. Ensure her choice was made with clear eyes rather than the heightened emotions of their journey's end. "Ready?" he asked, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Margaret nodded, gathering her shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Where's Tomas?" "Staying here tonight. Harrington offered him work for a few days breaking horses. He has a gift for it." They rode into Santa Fe together as the last light faded from the western sky, the town coming alive with lamps and lanterns. Despite its frontier location, Santa Fe had a settled, established feel that contrasted sharply with the rawness of Tucson. The mix of Spanish and Anglo influences was evident in the architecture and in the faces of the people they passed. The hotel Vince had mentioned proved to be a well-maintained establishment near the Central Plaza. He secured her a room, paying for 3 nights in advance, despite her protests. "Consider it payment for your cooking," he insisted. "Saved us from Tomas's idea of trail food." The room was simple but clean, with a real bed that looked impossibly luxurious after weeks of sleeping on the ground. A pitcher and basin stood ready for washing, and a small window overlooked a courtyard where a fountain trickled soothingly. "It's perfect," Margaret said sincerely. "Thank you." Vince stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand. "I've taken a room at the livery stable, less expensive." "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. "If you'd like, could show you around town a bit." "I'd like that very much." He nodded, seeming relieved. "Mid-morning, then. Get some rest, Margaret, you've earned it." After he left, Margaret indulged in the luxury of a proper wash with warm water and soap, changed into her cleanest remaining dress, and then sank onto the bed with a sigh of pure pleasure. The mattress, though likely stuffed with straw rather than feathers, felt impossibly soft compared to her bedroll. Yet despite her physical comfort, sleep proved elusive. Her mind raced with thoughts of the future, weighing possibilities, imagining different paths her life might take. By dawn, she had formed a plan, one that would allow her to test her certainty before making a final commitment. Vince arrived at the hotel shortly after breakfast, looking somewhat uncomfortable in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing. Margaret was struck anew by the fundamental decency in his features, the quiet strength that had been her anchor throughout their journey. "You look rested," he observed as they set out to explore the town. Margaret smiled. "Amazing what a real bed can do." "Though I confess, I almost missed the sound of the night birds and Tomas's snoring." That drew a laugh from him, a sound she had come to treasure for its rarity. "Don't tell him that. He denies it vehemently." They spent the morning wandering through Santa Fe's Central Plaza and surrounding streets. The town was a fascinating blend of cultures: Spanish, Mexican, Anglo, and Native American influences, evident in everything from the architecture to the goods sold in the marketplace. Margaret made a point of inquiring at the local school about teaching positions, maintaining the appearance of keeping her options open. The headmaster, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a scholarly manner, was enthusiastic about her qualifications. "We are always in need of educated women willing to brave the frontier," he told her. "The fall term begins in 3 weeks. If you're interested, I could hold a position for you." "Thank you," Margaret replied sincerely. "I'm considering several possibilities at present." "May I let you know my decision in a day or two?" "Of course, my dear. We would be fortunate to have someone of your experience." As they left the school, Vince was unusually quiet, his expression guarded. "Sounds promising," he said finally. "Good opportunity for you." Margaret studied him, noting the careful neutrality of his tone. "One of several I'm considering." His eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of hope visible before he looked away. Fair enough. They continued their tour of the town, stopping for a simple lunch at a small cantina, where the proprietress reminded Margaret of Elena from Valencia. By mid-afternoon, Margaret had seen enough to form a clear impression of what life in Santa Fe might offer more civilization than Tuxen. A blending of cultures that seemed more harmonious, opportunities for intellectual engagement through the school, and a small lending library she had discovered. Yet none of it called to her the way the open country had, the way the prospect of building a life with Vince on his ranch increasingly did. As they walked back toward the hotel, Margaret gathered her courage to share the plan she had formulated during her sleepless night. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she began carefully. Vince's step slowed, his attention fully on her now. "And I believe I know my answer, but I'd like to be absolutely certain." Margaret met his gaze directly. "Take me to your ranch. Let me see the life you're offering before I make my final decision." Surprise and hope warred in his expression. "You want to see the ranch first? Is that unreasonable, to want to know the place that might become my home?" "No," he said quickly. "Not unreasonable at all, just unexpected." "I've learned to be practical these past weeks," Margaret explained. "If I'm to become a rancher's wife, I should know what I'm committing to." The phrase rancher's wife brought a smile to Vince's face, one of the full, transformative ones that reached his eyes and softened the lines of his weathered features. "When would you want to go?" "As soon as you're ready to return. I could be packed in an hour." Vince shook his head in wonder. "You continue to surprise me, Margaret Gallagher." "Good," she said with a smile of her own. "I wouldn't want marriage to become predictable before it's even begun." His expression grew serious then, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Is that what you want?" Marriage? Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that despite her plan to see the ranch first, she was effectively making her choice now. "Yes, Vince, if you'll still have me, knowing I'm headstrong and opinionated and entirely ignorant of ranching." "Those sound like virtues to me," he said softly. Then, with a glance at the public street where they stood, he added, "I'd kiss you right now if we weren't in the middle of town." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Then perhaps we should find somewhere less public." The boldness of her suggestion surprised even herself, but the answering light in Vince's eyes was worth any impropriety. With unspoken agreement, they turned toward the outskirts of town, finding their way to a small park where cottonwood trees offered some privacy from passers-by. In the dappled shade, Vince took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "You're certain? This isn't gratitude or feeling obligated because I helped you?" "I'm certain," Margaret answered without hesitation. "These weeks have shown me who you are, Vince Quaid. A man of honor, of quiet strength. Someone I can trust with my future." She smiled softly. "And yes, someone I've come to love." It was the first time either of them had used that word, and its effect on Vince was immediate. Something in his expression broke open, revealing a vulnerability she had glimpsed only in rare moments before. "I love you too," he said, the words simple but profound. "Have since somewhere on the trail, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself." Then he was drawing her closer, one hand moving to cup her cheek with exquisite tenderness. Margaret's eyes fluttered closed as his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, gentle yet passionate, a perfect balance like the man himself. When they finally parted, Margaret felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, a certainty solidifying that this was exactly where she was meant to be. "Still want to see the ranch before deciding?" Vince asked, a hint of teasing in his voice. "Absolutely," she confirmed. "I'm a practical woman, Mr. Quaid. I don't make life-changing decisions based solely on excellent kisses." He laughed at that, the sound free and unguarded in a way she had never heard before. "Fair enough. We'll leave tomorrow if that suits. Should reach the ranch in about 10 days. "Another journey together," Margaret observed, her hand still in his. "Though this time I won't be driving the chuck wagon." "No," Vince agreed. "This time you'll be riding beside me." The double meaning was not lost on either of them. As they walked back toward town, making plans for their departure, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with physical structures, and everything to do with the man walking at her side. From 4 men blocking her path in Tuxen to this moment of clarity and purpose, the journey had been longer and more transformative than she could have imagined when she first arrived in the Arizona territory. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, side by side, just as Vince had suggested that fateful day when he cleared her path and said those simple words that had changed everything. "Walk beside me." They set out for Vince's ranch the following morning, leaving Santa Fe behind with the sunrise at their backs. Margaret had sent a polite note to the school headmaster declining the teaching position, explaining that she had accepted a proposal of marriage and would be establishing herself elsewhere. The return journey was entirely different from their outward one. No cattle to drive, no chuck wagon to manage, just the 2 of them on horseback with a packhorse carrying their supplies. They traveled at an easier pace, taking time to appreciate the landscape in ways the demands of the cattle drive hadn't allowed. Vince was more open now, sharing stories of his past that he had previously kept guarded. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, his parents' early deaths from fever, the uncle who had raised him with gruff affection. He spoke briefly of the war, the horror of battle at Shiloh and Gettysburg, the comrades lost, the disillusionment that had sent him westward seeking a place to heal. "The ranch saved me," he admitted one evening as they camped beside a small creek. "Having something to build, to nurture. Land doesn't care what you've seen or done, it just responds to how you treat it." Margaret listened, understanding better now the quiet man who had come to her rescue in Tucson. The pieces of his character, his reflexive protection of the vulnerable, his discomfort with praise, his self-sufficient nature made sense in light of his experiences. In turn, she shared more of her own history, the privileged but emotionally reserved household of her childhood, her parents' complicated relationship, her own struggles to find purpose after their deaths. "I think I was looking for somewhere to belong," she reflected. "Teaching gave me that to an extent, but there was always something missing." "And now?" Vince asked, his gaze steady across the campfire. Margaret smiled, the answer easy and true. "Now I've found it." They reached the ranch on the 10th day, cresting a rise in late afternoon, to see the buildings nestled in a valley below. It was smaller than Margaret had imagined, a main cabin built of logs and stone, a barn, corral, and a few outbuildings, but there was a solidity to it that spoke of careful construction and ongoing care. "It's not much," Vince said, a note of uncertainty in his voice for the first time since Santa Fe. Margaret studied the homestead with clear eyes, seeing both its limitations and its potential. The cabin was small, the amenities doubtless basic. Life here would involve constant physical labor, isolation from neighbors, and the ever-present challenges of weather and wilderness. Yet she also saw beauty in the surrounding landscape of rolling hills and scattered pine, in the clear stream that ran near the cabin, in the careful arrangement of the buildings that spoke of Vince's thoughtful planning. This was no temporary shelter but a true home, built with permanence in mind. "It's perfect," she said softly, and meant it. The relief in Vince's expression was palpable. He urged his horse forward, leading her down to what would become their shared home. The cabin's interior confirmed Margaret's expectations, simple but well-crafted, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, wooden table and chairs, and minimal furnishings. A small bedroom occupied one end, separated by a door that offered basic privacy. The windows were few but strategically placed to capture light and breeze. "I can build additions," Vince offered as she explored the space. "Another bedroom, perhaps, a larger kitchen area." Margaret turned to him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his practical suggestions. "It's a wonderful start, Vince. We'll make improvements together as we need them." That evening they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues. Despite the simplicity of their surroundings, Margaret felt a contentment deeper than any she had known in her previous life of relative comfort and social propriety. "Still certain?" Vince asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders. Margaret leaned into him, savoring the solid strength of his presence. "More than ever." They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit riding preacher who included Vince's ranch in his monthly rounds. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them and Tomas, who had returned from Santa Fe in time to stand as witness. Margaret wore her best remaining dress, freshly laundered and pressed, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. The preacher, a kindly older man who had seen many frontier marriages, pronounced them husband and wife with genuine warmth and a prayer for their future happiness. When Vince kissed her, no longer restrained by propriety or uncertainty, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home. Life on the ranch quickly established its own rhythm. Margaret applied the same determination to learning ranching skills that she had once devoted to her education and teaching. She learned to milk the cow Vince purchased as a wedding gift, to tend the kitchen garden she established near the cabin, to recognize the signs of approaching weather in cloud patterns and animal behavior. There were challenges, of course. The isolation sometimes weighed heavily, especially during Vince's occasional absences when ranch business took him to neighboring properties or the nearest town. Winter brought storms that could isolate them for days. Summer brought drought that threatened their water supply and grazing lands. Yet for every hardship, there were compensating joys: the breathtaking beauty of stars in the clear night sky, the satisfaction of shared labor, the deepening bond between them as they faced each challenge together. Margaret discovered reserves of strength and adaptability she hadn't known she possessed, while Vince found himself opening to emotions he had long kept buried. In the spring following their marriage, Margaret discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought both joy and practical concerns. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and childbirth on the frontier carried risks that couldn't be ignored. "We could move to town until after the baby comes," Vince suggested, worry evident in his expression. But Margaret shook her head firmly. "This is our home. Our child should be born here." With characteristic thoroughness, she prepared as best she could, reading medical texts Vince obtained on his next trip to Santa Fe, arranging for an experienced midwife from a nearby ranch to stay with them as her time approached, ensuring they had necessary supplies and equipment. Their son, Robert Vincent Quaid, was born on a clear autumn morning, his lusty cries announcing a healthy constitution that matched his parents' determined spirits. Holding him in her arms, Margaret felt a completeness that transcended all the achievements of her previous life. "He's perfect," Vince whispered, wonder in his voice as he gently touched the downy head of his son. "Like his mother." "I think he has your stubbornness," Margaret observed with a tired smile. He certainly took his time deciding to arrive. As the years passed, the ranch prospered under their joint management. Vince's knowledge of cattle and land combined with Margaret's organizational skills and education created an operation more successful than either might have achieved alone. The cabin expanded first with an additional bedroom for the children who followed Robert, then with an enlarged kitchen and dining area that became the heart of their home. Margaret established a small school for their children and those of the neighboring ranches, ensuring that frontier life didn't mean educational deprivation. There were difficult times, a severe drought that nearly broke them, an outbreak of fever that claimed the life of their third child despite all their efforts, the occasional conflicts with rustlers or land-hungry newcomers. Yet through each crisis, their partnership only strengthened, their commitment to each other and the life they were building never wavering. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting in Tuxen, Vince surprised Margaret with a gift, a small bound journal in which he had awkwardly but sincerely written their story. From the moment he saw 4 men blocking her path to their current life together. "I'm no writer," he apologized as she turned the pages, tears in her eyes at this unexpected gesture from her typically reticent husband. "But I wanted our children to know how it began, how close we came to never finding each other." Margaret closed the journal, deeply moved by the effort it must have cost him to commit their story to paper. "They'll treasure it, as I do." She looked out at the ranch, their home, their legacy, and then back to the man who had made it all possible with 4 simple words that had changed the course of her life. "Walk beside me," she said softly. "Best invitation I ever accepted." Vince smiled, the lines around his eyes now as much from laughter as from squinting into the western sun. "Best path I ever walked," he agreed, taking her hand in his. And as the sun set behind the hills of their ranch, painting the sky in colors no Boston drawing room could ever capture, Margaret Gallagher Quaid knew with absolute certainty that her journey from schoolteacher to frontier wife had been not an escape but a homecoming to the place, and the man she was always meant to find.